Welcome to Course Module 1 on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit from 1807. This is the first of 3 lectures in Module 1.1, in which we look at the introduction to Hegel's phenomenology, which runs from section 73 to section 89. The topic of this first lecture, 1.1.0, is simply enough a brief introduction to Hegel. Let's start with an outline of this lecture. We'll begin in section 1 with a brief overview of Hegel's significance and influence on subsequent philosophy. That's followed in section 2 with a look at some biographical and philosophical highlights. In section 3, we'll take a look at the general philosophical tradition Hegel co-founded and with which he is accordingly closely associated, German idealism. Finally, we'll turn in section 4 to the phenomenology of spirit, which is Hegel's first major work and will be the focus of our efforts in this course. Section 1. Hegel, Significance and Influence. So, Hegel is a giant of Western philosophy, at once intimidating because he is so dauntingly difficult to read and in many ways inescapable. He is inescapable because much of the 19th century was a reaction to Hegel, and we are in many ways a reaction to the 19th century. And so, in that roundabout way, there's a good deal of Hegel still with us. And if that way of thinking, that the reaction to something isn't just a flat-out rejection, and so that the reaction to something carries, contains, and maintains a good deal of that original something, if that thought is plausible or even intuitive to you, then, well, that's performative proof of Hegel's inescapability, because that way of thinking is, as we will see, quintessentially Hegelian. The wording here, though, is mine. It's not a textual quote. Now, this way of putting the point is, of course, not very rigorous yet. For one thing, the term reaction is left completely undefined, but I hope it'll get us into the dialectical swing of things. Let me tighten the screws of rigor just a little bit and give you a terminological heads up. Hegel has a technical term for this idea that in an intellectual, and later in Marx and Darwin in a material process, there's informational content, or there are structural dimensions that are carried, contained, and maintained through the process. Hegel calls this sublation, or in German Aufhebung. We'll have occasion to talk about this quite a bit later in the term because it's not self-explanatory and Hegel uses it throughout. So keep your eyes peeled. So Hegel has a direct influence on much of the thinking and doing that went on in the 19th century. In philosophy, there were warring factions of Hegelians, the old or right, as in conservative, Hegelians, and the young or left Hegelians, including folks like Marx and Ludwig Feuerbach. By the second half of the century, though, Hegel's star had faded significantly in Germany amid the rise of neo-Kantianism and positivism. But Hegel turned out to become tremendously popular again in mid-20th century French philosophy, mostly through the teaching and writing of the philosopher Jean Hippolyte, who authored the first translation of the Phenomenology into French. The existentialists, Sartre and Camus, the structuralists, Lévi-Strauss and Lacan, and the post-structuralists, Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, Barthes, and Lyotard, all learned their Hegel from or through Hippolyte. Beyond that, good arguments have been made and continue to be made by contemporary philosophers in the Anglo-American analytic tradition, notably and ongoingly by Robert Brandom at the University of Pittsburgh, and he's only the most prominent, that philosophy, and in a way all of us, are still catching up with Hegel. Putting Brandom's and others' carefully developed arguments like that is, of course, far too simplistic. The more cautious way of putting the point would be to say that despite their protestations, philosophers in the analytic tradition have in many ways, and often in remote and technical corners of their work, remained attached to Hegelian tropes, or as it's been called, paradigms, that seem a lot easier to deny than to shed. And that makes a proper accounting for their peculiar and peculiarly dialectical afterlife in analytic philosophy imperative. If that's your jam, Brandom's your guy. In this famous portrait, for which he sat in the year of his death, related to a cholera epidemic in Berlin, the German capital, where he was by now the undisputed philosopher king, nice coat, by the way, he looks pale and in ill health with those red-rimmed grey-blue eyes. To me, he also looks a tad uncomfortable, but it seems to be a philosophical discomfort. He seems unapproachable, even reproachful, and almost daring you to come at him. But above all, he looks stern, oh so stern. He seems to be looking back at us from the past or the future, basically saying, I was onto something, damn it. Deny it at your peril. Section 2. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, 1770 to 1831. Hegel was born in 1770 in southwest Germany into what was then, for reasons that would lead us too far afield to explain, called the Holy Roman Empire of German nations. Suffice it to say, first, that Germany thought of itself weirdly as somehow the legitimate continuation of the Roman Empire, and second, that geopolitically it was more an unholy mess than a holy empire, as can be seen from the map. Simplification and unification came in the 19th century in the form of the Vienna Congress in 1815, which followed the end of the Napoleonic Wars. More specifically, Hegel came from a family of government administrators and lawyers in Stuttgart, which was then the capital of the Duchy of Württemberg. That's the small, yellow-shaded area at the end of the black arrow. Today, Stuttgart is still a regional capital and is best known as the place where Mercedes-Benz are made. So Hegel was solidly middle class, but he nevertheless started out culturally and philosophically pretty much as a nobody. But he did have incredible roommate luck at the University of Tübingen, where he enrolled in 1788 at age 18. His roommates were the two Freddies, Friedrich Hölderlin and Friedrich Schelling. Hölderlin was destined to become arguably Germany's greatest poet ever, even though, or perhaps because, he went insane in his 30s. Side note, the picture in our course banner in Brightspace, that yellow building with the cute Rapunzel turret next to the weeping willow by the riverbank, that's the Hölderlin Tower in Tübingen, where the insane poet lived for some 30 more years. The other Freddie was Friedrich Schelling, who went on to become one of the preeminent German philosophers. More on him in a moment. I mean, what are the chances? Three of the absolutely leading lights of the era just happened to bunk in the same room together as freshmen? At any rate, the three roommates stayed friends for years and helped each other in innumerable personal and professional ways. For example, both Hölderlin and Schelling were instrumental in keeping the floundering Hegel employed in various tutoring jobs across Germany. The three friends got their start at a time of great scientific, economic, political, and philosophical transition and upheaval, an era of innovation and revolution. Modern experimental science was coming into its own with major discoveries and innovations in a variety of fields, especially in chemistry, biology, geology, and astrology, but also in mathematics. There were also major discoveries in the medical field that impacted millions of lives. It was the heyday, moreover, of the Industrial Revolution, with the invention of the power loom and the steam engine, issuing in the sort of societal changes, especially the development of an underprivileged working class that Marx would later address. And then, of course, it was the time of world historical political revolutions, including the French and American revolutions, which upset the traditional social and political order and paved the way for the modern administrative nation-state. Finally, there was the Haitian Revolution, which was the first major slave revolt since antiquity, and the only successful one in world history. It shook the Eurocentric establishment around the world to its core and proved to be a major inspiration for Hegel, as we will see in the chapter on the master-slave dialectic. In philosophy, Kant was the dominant figure who at least initially seemed to have done all there was to do philosophy-wise in his three critiques. He had combined centuries of rationalism in its Greek, German, and French flavors with the more recent British empiricism in a breathtaking and epochal synthesis. And, well, that was that. It seemed that all there was left to do in philosophy was to tie up loose ends, clean up, and systematize the things that Kant had already figured out. All philosophy, in short, seemed destined to be Kantian philosophy from now on. As a Kantian myself, I don't think that's entirely wrong or a bad thing, but the 1780s and 90s and the early 1800s were an incredibly fertile period in the history of thought. And first, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, then Friedrich Schelling, and soon Hegel, along with a host of other luminaries including Goethe, Schiller, Hölderlin, the brothers Schlegel, etc., started to shake things loose and transition away from Kant and the Enlightenment into German idealism and Romanticism. Throughout all of this, Hegel nevertheless remained incredibly indebted to Kant. That registers on a personal level too. He named the last of his three sons Immanuel. Cool name if you think of it, Immanuel Hegel. Has a ring to it. Here's Junior. The kid became a high-ranking Prussian government as well as Protestant church official and was a close associate of the imperial chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Section 3. German Idealism. The philosophical tradition now known as 19th century German idealism is usually summed up by just mentioning the three names we've already come across: Fichte, Schelling, Hegel. Fichte, who was about a decade older than the Tübingen Friends, was Schelling's friend and mentor, and was widely regarded by contemporaries as the torchbearer of post-Kantian philosophy. Yet, even though Fichte and Schelling were initially much bigger news, Hegel would end up outshining them, towering over not just 19th century philosophy, but the 19th century itself in ways neither of them ever did. So we start this course with Hegel instead of Schelling or Fichte because Hegel set the tone for almost all the philosophical, scientific, and even cultural developments of the 19th century in ways the others didn't. So what is that tone he set? There are a number of ways to get at it. I like to put it very simplistically, at least at the outset. Before Hegel, everybody's view of the world was essentially static. Sure, things were understood to be in motion, but they were moving in a passive, lifeless, mechanistic, clockwork or billiard ball causation kind of fashion. With Hegel, the world becomes animated, dynamic. Things begin to move, really move, on their own. And not at random, but in a guided, rational, if not necessarily theological or created, then nevertheless in a teleological, goal-directed, purposive sort of way. The source of all this dynamic activity was for Hegel a particular conception of idealism, according to which reason or rationality is inextricably tied up with the world itself, or rather, an idealism according to which the distinction between thought and being, between subject and object, is the result of active thinking processes that are simply a fact of the universe. Hegel sums this up in one of his catchphrases: "The rational is the real, and the real is the rational." That's also where German idealism becomes a bit woo-woo for most. Although it should be pointed out that Hegel's not simply a subjective idealist like George Berkeley, who held that a certain kind of stuff, mental stuff, exists, and that that's the only stuff that is. Hegel's position is not a hypostatization of ideas over things. It can instead be summarized as the view that the universe is fundamentally rational and that mind, not just individual minds, but what might be called a world spirit, is as much a real thing as the things we call material things. And that world principle is active, it's thinking. So advances in science and culture are, of course, in a narrow sort of way, products of specifically human mental activity. But what they really are, at a deeper level, is the universe, mental as well as material, coming to know itself. Mind and world, thought and being, subject and object, representation and thing represented are at the end of the day and quite literally the same thing. This is a kind of dynamic ontological monism. We will see that the phenomenology is basically Hegel's working out the epistemology that has to go with that kind of ontology. But regardless of Hegel's philosophical explanation of this inherent dynamism of the universe, we find a version of that dynamic worldview at play not only in Schopenhauer's conception of the will, where it is irrational, not rational, but in Marx's conception of both history and economics, as well as in Darwin's conception of evolutionary change. None of these views would have been quite possible without Hegel shifting the dynamic world engine into gear. And in many ways, this dynamic conception of the world is essentially still ours. After all, we don't conceive of natural processes in terms of mechanistic clockwork causality. In that sense, and even though you may never have heard of him or his views, Hegelian thinking is nevertheless never very far from our own daily lived reality. Why then did Hegel fall out of favor by the mid to late 19th century, especially in the Austro-Anglo-American analytic philosophy that dominated much of Western philosophy in the 20th century and that's still the dominant force in most Western philosophy departments today? Aside from the woo-woo, a somewhat simplistic but nevertheless not entirely false way of explaining why Hegel fell out of favor is to note that Hegel's signature claim to philosophical fame is his dialectic. And a dialectic is something that's by definition not analytic, and so not what this still dominant analytic philosophy is all about. Of course, Hegel's whole mode of operation is to reject such facile reductive dichotomies. I think that's a point in his favor in the matter at hand. Be that as it may, treating Hegel's dialectic as non analytic and therefore as not really philosophy is exactly how early analytic philosophers at the beginning of the 20th century, especially Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, saw the matter. It didn't help that analytic philosophy pays a premium on crystal clear style of presentation, whereas Hegel can be, well, painfully obscure, fully worthy of Hölderlin in his nuttier days. At any rate, after being booted from the Anglo Philosophy Club by a pair of upper crust Englishmen, a club membership in which apparently requires a pipe, and for nothing more than the crime of being a bit woolly, Hegel would soon enough and for a long time be persona non grata in Anglo American philosophy, his name rising at times almost to the level of a dirty word. But the way Hegel developed Kantian philosophy was neither accidental nor incidental to it. And to the extent that contemporary analytic philosophy has by now long acknowledged its Kantian roots, despite the best efforts of early analytic philosophers to disown Kant as well as Hegel, it is not surprising, indeed, it seems inevitable that a philosophy so rooted would in due course rediscover Hegel. And that's exactly what's been happening. So you may think that Hegel is too difficult or too antiquated to be wasting one's time on, but he may very well be the next big thing in the discipline. Section 4. The Phenomenology of Spirit, 1807. The Phenomenology of Spirit, or Phänomenologie des Geistes, is a very good place for this reappreciation of Hegel to start. The reason for this is that the phenomenology, seen here in its first edition from 1807, was only supposed to be a kind of necessary epistemic preparation from which his actual philosophy or his logic could then proceed. Specifically, the phenomenology was necessary in order to attain the standpoint of what Hegel in the final chapter of the phenomenology calls absolute knowing. Absolute knowing is roughly the moment at which the activity of knowing the thing and the thing known become, or the vantage point from which they can be seen to be, the same thing. Once that's established, the real work can begin. Hegel published that real work, which he called The Science of Logic or Wissenschaft der Logik, in two parts. Part 1 of The Science of Logic, the Objective Logic, appeared in two volumes in 1812 and 1813. Part 1, Volume 1 of the Objective Logic covers the logic of being. Part 1, Volume 2 of the Objective Logic covers the logic of essence. It's monstrously difficult stuff, and we won't be reading it here. Part 2 of the Science of Logic, the Subjective Logic, or Logic of the Concept, was published as a single volume in 1816. Philosophically, the three volumes of the Science of Logic are where Hegel develops his metaphysical idealism, or what I've called above, his dynamic ontological monism. Now, one way to get comfortable with Hegel in our own day is to say that if Hegel's metaphysics in the Science of Logic is a bridge too far for our tender and often naive realist philosophical sensitivities and proclivities, then there's nevertheless mountains of absolutely fascinating, insightful, and more importantly, deeply relevant philosophizing in his epistemology. So, crack open the phenomenology. Speaking of crack, there's of course a danger here. It's basically that the phenomenology becomes your gateway drug, like the Mary Jane of reefer madness days, while the really good stuff in the logic is still too strong for you. But watch out, soon enough you're hooked, and then you'll see what actually happens. That most Hegelian of phrases, which can of course be as much warning as enticement. Who wouldn't want crazed abandon? Let's not forget, Hegel tells us in the first sentence of the introduction to the phenomenology that philosophy, and really Hegelian philosophy, is the actual cognition of what in truth is. Hegelian philosophy is the identity of thought and being, but it's the active, dynamic identity of thought and being. Hegelian philosophy, in short, is what actually happens. So beware of the phenomenology. It may be more accessible for our non idealist times, but it may also just suck you in and be the sweet pill that makes life bitter or exciting for you. Okay, now, so the phenomenology of spirit is utterly fascinating, of course, but that's not least because of the circumstances under which Hegel wrote it. He was 36, utterly broke, and had an illegitimate child with his landlady on the way. He had a gig at Jena University in eastern Germany, where his pals Fichte and Schelling were teaching, but it was unpaid. The way it worked is that unsalaried professors could charge their students a fee directly at the door. So, as a student, you literally had to pay admission to the class. Wait a minute. But that's not a good way to make a living as a professor, especially if you're not already famous or have at least something of a following. So Hegel needed to become a salaried professor and fast. For that, he needed a book, and the phenomenology was that book. What's really interesting and revealing about Hegel as a philosopher and maybe as a person is that despite his desperate need to publish, he actually had 3 or 4 completed book length manuscripts unpublished sitting in his drawer, ready to go. Any one of them could have been his career ticket. And in fact, they were later published and are still in print as the Jena Systementwürfe. Not to mention, any one of them could have put food on the table and diapers on the kid. But he didn't publish them because, well, they weren't good enough. They didn't tell his, to be fair, very complicated story in just the right way. So if the first principle of academia is publish or perish, then certainly until the phenomenology, Hegel seemed to choose proactively the perish side of the deal. The other thing to know about that the circumstances of its publication is that at that very time, in late 1806, early 1807, Napoleon was on his campaign of conquest through Europe. And Napoleon just so happened to have set up camp in, you guessed it, Jena, where he promptly fought and won the Battle of Jena on October 14th, 1806. Against the Prussian army on a field not far from town, cannons literally rumbling in the background as Hegel was finishing his little book. Hegel himself encountered Napoleon as the emperor was surveying the town, which was already under his control, on his horse before the battle. Here's a drawing of that encounter. The Battle of Jena was a significant victory and was dear to Napoleon's heart. He named the very prominent bridge across the Seine in Paris, that nowadays leads straight to the Eiffel Tower, the Pont d'Iéna, in honor of the battle. And that's not the only, or for that matter, the most famous Hegel connection to a bridge. Jonathan Roebling, who designed and together with his son Washington and daughter-in-law Emily built the Brooklyn Bridge, that synthesis between the thesis of Manhattan and the antithesis of Brooklyn, was of course a student of Hegel's, and one might speculate he wove the dialectic straight into the fabric of the growing city and nation. So the next time you cross the Brooklyn Bridge, ask yourself, is the dialectic real? At any rate, it's a good thing Hegel didn't publish the turgid Systementwürfe and waited until the book was really ready. Along with Plato's Republic, Hume's treatise, and Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, the Phenomenology is inarguably one of the greatest works in 2,500 or so years of Western philosophy. It is also by several magnitudes more difficult even than Kant. Speaking of difficulty, we will skip Hegel's fascinating preface, which you see here at the very top of the table of contents highlighted in yellow, and which runs from page 3 to 46. He wrote that after the book was finished and had become about twice as long as initially planned because of complications he didn't anticipate, and now records in the preface. If you're interested, take a crack at it. I love his discussion of truth and the difference between mathematical and philosophical cognition, roughly from sections 39 through 55. Instead, we will start by reading the introduction that he wrote before the turbulence hit. From there, we'll read parts A and about half of part B. That's chapters 1, 2, and 4 of the Phenomenology. It's about 46 of a total of 467 pages, or about 10% of the book. It's fair to say we won't get a comprehensive view of the Phenomenology, let alone of Hegel's overall philosophy. Still, in the parts of the Phenomenology that we will be reading, we'll learn a whole lot about Hegel. Hegel there introduces his overall method, makes some genuinely fascinating philosophical observations about ordinary objects and ordinary people, and makes what I think is a moment of genuine philosophical progress and discovery in the chapter on mastery and servitude, or what's commonly known as the master-slave dialectic. There he discusses, among other things, the importance of labor to self-realization, an idea that was absolutely crucial for Marx. All right, enough stage setting. I hope this whets your appetite a bit. In the next lecture, 1.1.1, we'll take a look at the opening four sections of the introduction, section 73 to 76, in which Hegel discusses a certain form of philosophical skepticism that arises quite naturally out of the misguided and overly simplistic and non-dialectical way that philosophy had been done in the past. That's to say, before Hegel. He then talks about the skepticism of that skepticism. In other words, the skepticism that equally naturally arises about the whole apparently pointless enterprise of philosophy. And why, even though the latter skepticism is perfectly understandable, philosophy nevertheless cannot be dismissed as easily. This leads him to propose a different kind of philosophical investigation from the one that leads into simplistic but crippling skepticisms, and that must be conducted. The phenomenology is to be that investigation.